Inside Germany, the people had been faced with difficult political choices. The communists had already tried and failed to wreck the government. Other parties suggested a variety of ways of dealing with Germany's problems. But when Ebert became president of the new German Republic in August 1919, he found himself facing other threats. There were, for instance, the extreme nationalists who couldn't bring themselves to believe that the German army had lost the war and often greeted returning troops as heroes. They'd already blamed the government for signing the armistice, and now they blamed them for signing the shameful Treaty of Versailles. And then there were the Freikorps, or Free Corps, bands of ex-servicemen who'd tasted blood and power in their battles with the communists. In March 1920, these two forces combined to try and take over Berlin. The army refused to fire on the Freikorps, who were only defeated when the workers of Berlin went on strike and refused to cooperate with the rebels. Political extremism seemed to have become part of everyday life. And then there was the vital question of reparations. In 1921, the Allies were still discussing how much Germany should finally pay. Aristide Briand, the French Prime Minister, wanted a definite sum to be fixed quickly, and Germany made to pay. The rebuilding of war-damaged France was costing the country a great deal of money. Why should the French be taxed more heavily to pay for all this when the money could be squeezed out of Germany? But the Germans, who'd been summoned to hear the Allied demands, protested that these would place an intolerable burden on their people. They'd argued that the Germany to which they were returning had suffered poverty and unemployment in the years since the war and couldn't afford the vast sums demanded by the Allies. Germany was already in a bitter mood. Might not reparations only make things worse? But these arguments didn't impress the Allies, who fixed a sum of £6,600 million for the Germans to pay. That sum would have to be paid in goods as well as money. Most would come from here in the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. But at the end of 1922, the Germans fell behind with their payments, and Raymond Poincaré, the new French Prime Minister, decided to act. If Germany wouldn't pay in full and on the nail, then France would help herself. So, on the 11th of January 1923, French and Belgian troops entered the Ruhr to force the Germans to pay up. There was, of course, after Versailles, no German army big enough to stop them. At first, the French believed that they could make the Germans work for them. But suddenly, German politicians and people were united in a common cause: hatred of the French. And huge protest meetings were held all over Germany. Workers in the Ruhr refused to cooperate with the enemy, and the German government supported the strikers. Germany's industrial heart stopped beating, and the goods trains, which should have been carrying German wealth to France, lay idle in the sidings. The French hit back by bringing in their own workers to get things moving again. Their attitude towards the Germans in the Ruhr began to harden. They tried to cut the Ruhr off from the rest of the country. German visitors were searched as if they were entering a foreign land. They deported the leaders of the passive resistance, German officials, and even the police. The result was violence. German workers had been killed in riots at Essen in March. Their funeral was turned into a vast demonstration of protest. Hatred grew. Germans began killing French soldiers, and at the funeral for one of them, tempers flared into acts of brutality. "1923 was disastrous for Germany. In that year, the great German inflation reached its peak. For some time, the value of the mark had been dropping, and as the value of the notes decreased, so the amount of notes needed to buy things grew. Banks became more and more hard-pressed to meet the ever-increasing demand for paper money. For their customers, suitcases replaced wallets. To meet this crisis and pay the strikers in the Ruhr, the government simply printed more money. And as it lost its value, so it cost more and more to pay wages to buy hundreds of thousands. Millions, whatever figure was printed on the notes, really meant nothing. The German mark was worthless. As in a fearful dream, people's life savings were blown away like leaves in a gale. As Germany slid towards disaster, Gustav Stresemann was appointed Chancellor. It was a time of crisis. The loss of production in the Ruhr was making inflation even worse, and Stresemann realized that the only way to help the economy back to normal was to call off resistance there and get production going again. The government also announced that Germany would resume the payment of reparations. It was the only possible way of getting the French out. But to the nationalists, it looked like yet another pathetic surrender to Germany's enemies. General Ludendorff, who'd never accepted that Germany had been defeated, gave his support to Adolf Hitler, the leader of the new National Socialist Party. In Munich, the capital of Bavaria, they decided to try and overthrow the government. But Hitler's stormtroopers were not yet powerful enough and couldn't get the support of the army or the police. Their November uprising failed and merely ended in confusion and 14 deaths. Ludendorff and Hitler were put on trial for treason. Ludendorff was let off. Hitler was sent to prison, where he brooded on his failure for a few months in rather comfortable surroundings.